Welcome to the WARC podcast. I'm Anne-Marie Kerwin, America's editor. Today we're going to be talking about WARC's new report, The Multiplier Effect. Marketing is at a turning point. For the past decade, we've seen a shift towards performance marketing tactics that have led to missed opportunities for growth. The choice of whether to invest in brand or performance can seem like a duel when it's really a duet. A better way to approach marketing efforts is to see brand and performance as part of an integrated growth strategy led by the CMO. WARC's report, The Multiplier Effect, lays out the evidence for how investment in brand drives business growth. We've created this report with 4 partners: Analytic Partners, Bera AI, System1, and Profit. And this is the third in our series of podcasts that talk to each of the WARC partners about the evidence they contributed to this report. In the first episode, I spoke with Mike Benkies of Analytic Partners about the pitfalls of depending too heavily on performance marketing tactics. Next, I spoke with Ken Favaro and Michael Ray from Bera AI about the significant role brand equity plays in contributing to growth. If you haven't listened to either of those yet, you can find them on WARC.com. Today, we'll be diving deeper into how creativity plays its role in driving the results you are looking for. My guest today is John Evans, Chief Customer Officer of System1 and host of Uncensored CMO podcast. Welcome, John.
Hey, it's good to be here. How are you doing?
Yeah, I'm great, thanks. So we're here to talk about the multiplier effect. And a major finding of the multiplier effect is that investing in brand equity strengthens the performance of your marketing through every stage of the funnel. So to invest in great brand work is a better way to deliver for your business goals. So why is creativity so important in creating great brand work?
I think it's incredibly important. And so many brands don't realize this. And it's one of those things that once you see the evidence for how important creativity is, you realize how most brands should focus more on it, not less. And I think over the last maybe 15, 20 years, we've become so obsessed with short-term performance marketing, chasing quarterly numbers. And we forget that great brands are built over years, not built over quarters. And I think that's why our industry has veered, off into kind of short-term metrics rather than long-term metrics. So, creativity has got an incredible role to play. I mean, there are lots of different sources of data on this, but, most data sources suggest it's probably the second most important lever at your disposal behind the size of your brand. I mean, a number of studies from Effie and Data Decisions that show that. So creativity is very important. We don't always give it the importance that it deserves. And in fact, to dramatize the point, last year at Cannes Lions, myself, Adam Morgan and Peter Fields did a piece of work called The Extraordinary Cost of Being Dull. And it was a funny thing, really, because I think we all know that creativity is important, making emotional, engaging, impactful long-term brand communication we know works, but we've known that for a long time and yet still we're not doing it. So we set ourselves the challenge of dramatically bringing it to life for people. And we're actually inspired by Daniel Kahneman, who had this loss aversion theory. And Daniel Kahneman said that the pain of a loss is twice the pleasure of a gain. And we thought, you know what? Why don't we put the cost of not doing powerful creative work in pounds and pence and dollars and cents, right? So we set ourselves a task of actually putting a price on not being creative. And so we use the System1 database because we measure pretty much every ad in the US and UK, and we're looking for emotional response. And the proxy for interesting is creative that generates emotional response, and dull is one that generates no emotions. Actually, this is a surprising statistic, actually, that almost 50% of all the emotions in the world that we measure at System1 is absolutely nothing, is neutrality, which shocks people because you kind of think, really? Like half the advertising we do or half the emotions reported are nothing? That just shows the level of waste. So what we did very simply is we looked at the 20 odd years of IPA award-winning data, the same data set that Les Binet and Peter Field used when they wrote the long and the short of it. And we looked at campaigns that drove an emotional response versus campaigns that didn't. And how much more did the boring campaigns have to spend on media to match the outcomes of the interesting campaigns? So outcomes being profit, sales, market share, things like that. And the number we ended up with, on average, you'd have to spend £9.8 million more if your creative is boring than if your creative is interesting. And we thought, you know what, like how much talent, creative agency, directors, producers, influencers, whatever you want, but how much talent would that money buy you to go and make something interesting? So we kind of concluded that no brand can afford to be dull, because the waste. But we're not measuring advertising in that sense before. So we tried to bring it to life. And perhaps the thing that sort of stuck is Adam Morgan gave me a bit of a challenge. He said, well, at System1, you test creative and you look for emotional response. He said, what's the most boring thing you could test? And he came up with this idea and he said, why don't you test cows eating grass? How would cows eating grass do against your benchmark of all advertisers in the US and UK? Now, bear in mind, we're talking about TV advertising, and we pick up obviously major TV advertisers. So these are people that have got decent budgets. But we put the cows into test. And the thing that blew our minds is that the cows eating grass beat 50% of the world's best advertisers, which was a sobering kind of thing. But it's funny how that was the bit everyone remembered in our presentation, was this image of cows eating grass kind of outperforming half of the world's advertising. So look, that was a sort of a stunt really, but it pointed to an important point, which is creativity is very powerful. We know it can drive business. We know that it's important for brand building, but we so often don't give it the kind of respect that it deserves. And so we were trying to get people's attention by doing that.
That's great. And, speaking of the sort of aversion effect, another thing that we found in the multiplier effect is that if you move from performance only to a more mixed approach of doing brand and performance investment, you can get a median increase in revenue ROI by 90%. But if you move the other way, you go from an integrated approach to performance only, you see a median decrease of 40% in revenue ROI, which is a way for us to say, even though it appears those performance metrics are working for you, you're missing out on the growth. And I know at
100%.
System1, there's a similar correlation evaluating how an ad does in the short term and long term, with only 12% of the best short term ads delivering in the long term. Can you
Yeah.
explain how that star and spike ratings work and what that tells us about how ads perform?
Yeah, of course. I mean, actually, I'll use a Mark Ritson quote here, which is the most important word in the long and the short of it is and. And I think this is what people kind of forget, don't they? They kind of go, either we're performance marketers or we're brand marketers. And it's like some kind of a tribe, you have to join one or the other. And as he points out, as the authors of the report point out, it's about getting the blend between the two. But just to explain star and spike, and then I'll bring back to the brilliant insight that you just started with there about how one drives the other, but not the other way around. Star rating is simply our measure of how much emotion that your campaign creates and which type of emotion. Because again, going back to Daniel Kahneman, where we got inspiration for the name of our company, in fact, System1, is the better we feel towards the brands, the more likely we are to buy. And he's got a number of heuristics. So the better you feel about something, more likely you're to buy. The quicker it comes to mind, again, the more likely you are to buy. So things we're familiar with are more automatic for us in terms of decision making, are more likely to be the things we buy. So we, at a top line level, we measure long-term potential for a brand. And we do that by the strength of positive emotion that the campaign might create. We also measure fluency, which is how quickly and overall how many people can remember your brand having been exposed to it, which is the second heuristic Kahneman talks about. And the third one is our short-term measure. And interestingly, for short-term measure, we're looking at how strong the emotion is combined with how quickly the brand comes to mind. And we've done loads of studies validating all three, but basically the short-term one is like, if it comes to mind quickly, and it creates a response, like a strong response, you're much more likely to talk about it, go online, search, recommend to your friends, et cetera, et cetera. So, and we've done lots of studies over the last kind of 5 to 10 years looking at those metrics and then what happens in the real world. And the really great thing is there's a very strong correlation between star rating and long-term market share and between spike rating and short-term sales uplift. And interestingly, what we found is if you just look at media spend alone, you get a weakish correlation. But if you overlay star and spike, you get a strong correlation. So roughly what it tells us is your media choices are half your impact. The creative choices are the other half. So what we're trying to do at System1 is make the case for the creative element to make the creative element work as much as it can by generating emotional response, lodging your brand into memory so that at some point in the future, buyers will buy. Now, to circle back to your first observation, which is a brilliant one, we had thought that, advertising kind of works on two dimensions. There's the immediate dimension and then there's the future dimension. And actually what we found is that long term should be rebranded as lasting. It's not that you have to wait until some point in the future where suddenly, as if by magic, the campaign you did 2 years ago is suddenly going to start working. It's not like that, because people are in and out of market all the time, right? And there's the amazing Ehrenberg-Bass statistic, which is one of the most brilliant statistics ever, which is on average, this is on average, on average, 95% of people in the category in which you advertise are not considering buying you. And it's funny, it sounds like, oh no, that's like only 1 in 20 people could I try and appeal to today. But it's a really profound data point, actually, because once you understand that, you realize your primary job as a marketer is to influence people's thinking in the future. And therefore, you have to be emotional, you have to be remembered, and you have to be associated with the occasion in which you're likely to be bought. And these are the kind of fundamental basics. But when you understand that, you realize that actually the brand building work becomes ever so much more important, because it's much easier to convert people if you've done the brand building job. And this is really coming back to your point, which I think is a super powerful one. We found that really good brand building campaigns had an immediate impact and a lasting impact, whereas really good short-term campaigns were unlikely to have any long-term impact. So long drives short, short doesn't drive long very often. Right. Of course, there are some cases where it does, but looking at Star and Spike, we're able to demonstrate that overwhelmingly, brands that do well on Star also do well on Spike, but brands that just do well on Spike don't tend to do particularly well on Star. And that's a kind of really significant finding, I think, from the report.
Yeah. And so what are some examples of campaigns that you've seen that do well on both, have a high star and high spike rating? And is that rare to have that?
Yeah, it's not totally rare, but there are actually, I should explain the star rating system, because when I explain the star rating system, you'll realize how rare great brand building is. So going back to our cows, so we measure a 5-star system where 1 star is based on the work we've done, likely to have no long-term impact, up to 5-star, which is potentially could have a 3%, or other campaigns that got a 5-star typically saw a 3% share gain in their category and then everything in between. Now, here's the thing. About 50% of all campaigns we measure are 1-star campaigns, all going back to the neutrality point, didn't create an emotion, didn't create a response, and therefore unlikely to shift the dial for the brands. So the first thing to say is getting a high star is rare. About 1% of all ads that we measure ever get into the 5-star territory. So we're talking about 1 in 100 immediately when we're talking about 5-star advertising. Any brand in that 5-star category is almost certain to also be driving short term. So good examples of that, if I just take good examples this year, Cadbury would be an amazing example of a brand that has unlocked a campaign idea that's kind of familiar over many years, taps into the emotion of the occasion and the nostalgia associated with their brand, are very, very good at how they communicate. In fact, it's not just, by the way, this is not just about TV advertising. They're on-pack promotions where they kind of remove the words, for example, or they divide their pack up into little sections going, who cooked, who ate, and who did the dishes, things like that. I don't know if you've seen that one, but Cadbury is a very good example, because it doesn't matter whether it's in store, whether it's online, whether it's out of home, whether it's on TV, they have an ability to create an emotional response. And that's very, very useful for driving short-term response. Other great examples, so UK examples I'm going through at the moment. Aldi, the German supermarket, is probably one of the best examples that I've got, because if you go back to 7-8 years ago when they first came up with their Kevin the Carrot Christmas creative, they're a discount supermarket. So if you look at over the time period, the number of stores they've had is pretty similar. The level of discounting they do is pretty similar. So what's good is you can actually see the campaign impact and how it's done, both in the short and long term. So how many people literally went into their stores at Christmas, and then how did they grow share in the following year? So it's a really good case study. It's an IPA winning case study, won the Grand Prix. It's also an Effie's, I think might even be an Effie's Grand Prix. I'd need to check, but I think they've got a lot of Effies and also IPA golds. But what's lovely about it is they've done the econometrics and they've looked at the link between the star rating got at Christmas and the market share gain in the following 12 months. And they're able to identify it's around 70% of the revenue growth of the business attributable to the campaign, because they know precisely how much store traffic increased after the campaign and it ran. So I love that example, because it's very, a German discount grocery store, right? It's very sort of, there's nowhere to hide, because it's literally how many people go to store, how much they spend. And Christmas is also the most competitive time for any advertiser in the world. It's the highest average star rating of any category, any time that we pick up in the world. So it's a really tough category. And they've done a very impressive job over sort of 6 or 7 years. And so you can see the consistent growth in sales and market share coming as a result of that. So that's definitely one of the best I've seen.
That's so great because it does bring up so many aspects that we say make really great brand work, which is that creative consistency and having a distinctive asset that you come back to over and over again to unlock the memory. So, one of the other pieces of advice we give in the report is that advertisers should be thinking about creating brand platforms rather than just campaigns. And the idea behind a brand platform is that you're going to have elements that can run across all the kinds of different executions that you'd be showing your messages, but they'd be emotionally engaging work that gives reasons to buy right now. So, um, when we're talking about brand platforms, are there any examples that come to mind for you of like a great brand platform idea?
Look, it's a absolutely top bit of advice as well. Think in platform terms, not campaign terms, because I think that the two reasons for that is, one, you want something with longevity, because we know how important being consistent is over time. So that's number one. But number two, you want something that wherever you show up as a brand, wherever occasion, whether it's online or offline, in store, not in store, you want the customer to experience the same thing, and you want the idea to translate. And again, it's tempting as marketers to just think about the above the line bit, whereas actually the money in the short term particularly is made below the line. So it's absolutely top advice you give in the report. Platform. One brand I really admire actually in the US that's doing some great work is McDonald's, and they seem to have done. Actually, it knits together distinctive assets, consistency, and also platform ideas. So distinctive assets, I think will be well known in terms of the arches. I'm loving it. The jingle, those things become very familiar, and you only need. In fact, even the voiceover I find with McDonald's, I hear the voiceover and I go, that must be a McDonald's ad. So again, they've invested in those things very, very well. But you talked about platforms, and one that I love is favorite orders. And what they did in America absolutely brilliantly. And this again was when McDonald's wasn't necessarily the coolest brand in town, but they partnered with celebrities just to find out what are their favorite orders, which might sound like a really simple thing to do, but it works on a number of levels. So the first thing it did is it created this social proof. So suddenly you thought, so McDonald's now is the the brand of choice for my favorite rapper or my favorite pop star or my actor that I like. So it created social proof. Secondly, it created influence, because suddenly you had lots of people doing a very simple thing, which is just going, oh, here's my order when I go into McDonald's, kind of thing. And that created intrigue. Oh, how does this actor, what do they choose, compared to this one? And then also what it did cleverly was, and I think, because I interviewed the McDonald's team at Wyden and Kennedy about this, is I think for the first time, they actually made the favorite order as an order that you could get. So you go into McDonald's and actually ask for a favorite order as well. And that gives you a wonderful ability in outlet to bring to life this, and then you connect the association. And that's why platforms work so well, is that they basically pull together. It's a multiplier effect, isn't it? That's one of the multiplying effects, because by joining up the different elements of activation, you get this basically compounding effect where, what you see in outlets reminds you of what you saw on TV, you're reminded of driving down the road when you see it out of home. And that gives you that compound multiplying effect. And that's where I think platforms, both from a time series point of view and through the line point of view, give you that kind of compounding effect, which is so powerful.
Yeah, and that McDonald's example is so great because another advantage that we found is that strong creative actually leads to higher incremental sales. And I know McDonald's actually was able to show that the profitability of the favorite orders meals were higher on average than like a normal meal would be because there was such a drive to get incremental sales on that order. So I know that System One also has found a correlation between strong creative and sales.
Yeah, it's a great question actually about can we link, I guess, Star and Spike to sales results? Because of course, as a former CMO myself, the reason actually that I really love working with System One is that actually it predicted actual behavior. And I ran a campaign on Ribena, and again, I remember seeing the prediction, and actually I was really impressed by how close the prediction was in real life. So, but look, that was just my own experience. But probably the best example actually is one of our biggest customers actually is Sky, who's I think at last check was either the biggest or one of the biggest advertisers in the UK. Mark Ritson actually wrote about how they use pre-testing because they actually did a 4-year econometric study looking at the link between pre-testing the creative and in-market results. And they work across a number of different categories like mobile phones, broadband, obviously entertainment, which is what they're famous for. So a long data set, I think 300 or 400 ads. And what was great about it is there was a really close relationship between the prediction, the creative score, and how the campaign performed. Most excitingly, actually, for me, because we often talk about long term, because at System One, we're kind of flying the flag for the impacts in the long term, because that's traditionally the harder bit to measure. But actually, what we found in this study was there's an amazingly close relationship between the creative itself and actual people downloading films or signing up for broadband or ordering phones in the short term as well. So it's a really, really good example that when we're talking creativity, it's not just, it's really important to remember that creativity is there to deliver a business outcome. And what I love about this report, particularly, as well as examples like Sky, is that we can give the evidence for how creativity impacts on the bottom line. And that is not just satisfying because that's what we're here to do, but what it does, importantly for marketers, is give marketers confidence to be able to demonstrate their value to their business in both the short term and the long term. So you can start to make the case for investing more in great creative in businesses. And I think that's something I'm so passionate about, giving the tools to marketers everywhere. And this is why this report is so cool, actually, by the way, because in this report is so much evidence for how you can build brands in the long term, but most importantly, deliver, bottom line business results. And at the end of the day, there's nothing that's going to make you more popular in the boardroom than being able to evidence, how your campaign delivered results. That's one way to get a promotion, I can say.
For sure. Yeah. So we mentioned it briefly when we were talking about McDonald's, but I want to talk a little bit more about the role of distinctive brand assets and how they play in creativity. Tell us why they're so important and how can a marketer better leverage those?
Yeah, it's a super question. I think like distinctive brand assets are probably the Jedi trick that most marketers should be doing more that they don't do. Because if you think about it, our job is to make people feel something towards our brand. And importantly, for us to be remembered when they're in category thinking about buying you, right? So you want to be the toothpaste that people think about when they're buying toothpaste, or the car that people think about when they're changing their car, right? That's the job of the marketer, to be in the consideration set at the point you're making a decision. Now, of course, it's one thing having an emotional campaign that makes people feel good. That's fine. But do they remember you? And this is where I think distinctive brand assets have got such an important role to play, because what they do is they connect those things together. So you might see an ad, you might feel great about seeing the ad, it might stick in your head, but if you don't connect it to the brand, it's wasted. And that's where I think distinctive assets, because what they do is they join everything together and they also become shortcuts. So, I mean, a small example for you, one of the campaigns from 3 or 4 years ago was Churchill the dog. Churchill, the car insurance provider, had changed from I think they'd animated Churchill. So it was a big story, right? Churchill's gone into the modern age. They're now animated him. Anyway, the new campaign was Churchill on a skateboard cruising down a high street. And it's a lovely concept, because the concept was like, if only every insurance felt like this, right? So they're kind of taking the insight that insurance is stressful. Actually, Churchill makes it easy, right? So it's an obvious insight, beautifully brought to life with a dog that everyone knows, right? So the name is obviously the name of the dog. But what was really interesting about it was beyond the obvious that I saw it and I knew it as Churchill, We tested the 30-second and the 5-second. The 5-second scored the same as the 30-second. Now, that is almost unprecedented because normally you need 30 seconds to tell your story, to create the drama, to kind of make people feel something, to have a twist, all that sort of thing, the kind of stuff that we all know. But what was amazing about Churchill the dog is that Churchill the dog was so associated with the brand, so associated with the creative, that even just having the dog was enough to remind people of the entire idea and the company. And I mean, another good example of that is Should Have Gone Specsavers, because there was a brilliant example recently, actually. I don't know if you saw this, but I think it went wild on LinkedIn when this happened. But Specsavers did an advert in Sydney Airport that simply said, "Welcome to Melbourne." And I was just like, that's so clever. That is, but the reason it's clever is we all understand the joke, right? We're all in on this joke of should have gone Specsavers. So even a distinctive asset can actually be an idea. In fact, Orlando Wood in his book calls them fluent devices, but he basically says things that your brand owns. It could be a character, it could be a tagline, but it can be an idea, like "You're not you when you're hungry" from Snickers, for example. Should have gone Specsavers. Again, brilliant example. What's so clever about them, though, is that you suddenly don't need to put the context all the time. You don't need the big setup. That actually, the more familiar people are with your construct, the more you can play with it, the more you can do it quickly, the more it can turn up online as well as offline. So it just amplifies the ability of you to get your message across in simple ways and to be remembered when people are buying. So I honestly, if I were to start a job, as a brand marketer again, the very first thing I'd do is test my distinctive assets, understand what they are, and relentlessly focus on building them into everything I do, and ideas as well as just physical distinctive assets, so that I can then own something, and then basically then that means increases my chance of being remembered. So genuinely super, super important and comes through in all the data.
So, John, let's talk about the System1 and WARC work that we did looking at the ROI database from WARC compared to System1's star ratings.
Yeah, thanks for reminding me about this, because actually I love it when data sets combine, because obviously, we have our own proprietary data where we're in the business of measuring emotion, right? So our job is to go, how do campaigns make people feel? Do they remember you? And because we're in the prediction business, we kind of get involved early to look at how might it work. So it's really satisfying then when we work with someone like yourself with the WARC database, because you've got the ROI data from the campaigns. So we had this, I think it was maybe a couple of years ago, we had this meeting going, wouldn't it be great to go take the System1 predictions of how the campaign might do, overlay, and I think it's tens of thousands. I'd need to check, but it's a lot of data, right? Then look at the WARC database of all the ROIs from those campaigns, and does the prediction like kind of actually play out in real life? So we did it very simply. So we literally took 1 and 2 star being low, 3 star being mid, and 4 and 5 star being very high. And then we looked at the average ROIs in each of those categories, all the campaigns that match those categories, what were they? And the ROI in the bottom category typically was 3.3 times. In the middle category was like 4.5 times. In the top category was like 8 times. So basically you got this. Firstly, it matched, which is like phew, So the better the campaign we predicted, the more emotion it was, the more likely it was to lead to ROI. But it was exponential. So that the jump going, and by the way, we find this on System1 as well, because 50% of campaigns we tested 1 star, only 1% of 5 stars. So the 5-star ones really are exceptional. 4 stars, about 3%. So 4 and 5 star, you're in the top 4 or 5% of all work everywhere. So what was great is that was also the work that was more than double the ROI of anything else in the data. So in super simple terms, if you can get to the top 5% on our database, you're looking at double the outcome based on the WARC database on average. Of course, these are big data sets. We're talking about averages, and everything within there can be up and down. But to see a dramatic correlation like that was pretty cool. So yeah, thank you to the lovely people at WARC for sharing the data and letting us do that work. That was pretty awesome.
Yeah, that was a great result for sure. So we've talked about a lot of different ideas. Don't be dull, and creative consistency, and figure out your distinctive brand assets and really put them to work. So if a marketer is getting ready to turn towards doing an integrated campaign, what advice would you say is most important for them to keep in mind?
That's a really good question. Look, there's a number of things. I think the first thing, which is a really odd answer to this question, right, is understand what has already worked. Because I think the first trap that every marketer falls into is they have to invent something new. And inventing something new is kind of like going back to the bottom of a snakes and ladders board and having to kind of start all over again. That feeling you get, go, oh, I've got to climb this ladder again. So what marketers really need to do is understand what already works. What associations do your audience have with your brand? Which distinctive assets do you already know? Which campaign ideas, straplines, personalities, characters, whatever, do you already have to work with? So start with what you already know. Then when you're developing something, and this is advice that you give in the report, which I think is brilliant, think in platforms, not in campaigns. Campaigns come and go, but platforms can potentially last forever. And platforms can connect up everything that you do. So again, understanding your brand and what it stands for, then creating platforms that can work through the system. So think about how your clever idea for TV turns up in store. How is it going to convince the buyer in the supermarket to pick you rather than somebody else? So think about how it works across all those different layers. And then the other bit of advice, which is, again, something that I think we know, but we don't do, is be consistent. Because actually, we've learned this through System1 data as well, is the same idea delivered consistently over time actually gets better. Now, we have this stupid notion in marketing, which I think it's like kind of some kind of scheme, which is everything wears out, right? So what happens is the moment we get up to a certain number of, minutes of airtime, we go, right, let's change the campaign because everyone's bored of it. Well, the reality is the only people that are bored of it is you and maybe the other people in the brand team, right? We tend to pull things off air the moment that people are starting to like it. Because again, back to Kahneman, actually we find that familiarity with something breeds contentment, not contempt. So we are creatures of habit. We are creatures of familiarity. And you don't want to change things too much too quickly. So we did a report last year actually called Compound Creativity, and we looked at lots of variables. So it could be, how consistent are you with the team you work with in terms of agency? How consistent is the strategy? How consistent are the elements of the strategy that you deliver? The execution. By the way, we're not saying run the same TV ad forever, right? We're not necessarily suggesting that, of course, right? We all could go home tomorrow if that was the case. But we're saying that great ideas actually build over time, and you can refresh the execution. I mean, Yorkshire Tea is one brilliant example of that. So their insight, where things are done proper, is solid insight based on a phrase from Yorkshire, based on something that's true about the brand. But that's a platform that every couple of years they refresh, and it turns up in unexpected ways. But the insight is exactly the same. The strategy is the same. The actors they get are always Yorkshire personalities with Yorkshire accents, so they even think about things like that. So being consistent is something that most brand managers find incredibly hard to do, but the benefit of being consistent is incredible because it compounds over time. And therefore, if you can stick at something for more than just the 1 year, which is what most people tend to do, you'll be surprised at the benefits that come with that.
That's terrific. Thank you, John. This has been such a great conversation. Thanks for joining me.
It's been my absolute pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
This is the third in a series of conversations we'll be having here on the WARC podcast over the next few months, making the case for investing in brand building. Our next Marketing Truth, the Multiplier Effect podcast will feature Partner Profit, and we'll be talking about organizational changes to avoid siloing your efforts. I'm Anne-Marie Kerwin, America's editor for WARC. Be sure to subscribe and follow the WARC podcast so you don't miss the next episode. Thanks for listening.